The first thing I heard wasn't my mother's voice. It was laughter. Not the warm kind that fills a wedding hall with happiness. It was the quiet, uncomfortable laughter people use when they don't know whether to look away or pretend they didn't hear something cruel. I froze just outside the ballroom doors, my hand still wrapped around the silver handle. Then my father said it. "Oh, don't mind her. She's just the family shame." More laughter. Someone asked, almost jokingly, "Family shame?" My mother answered before my father could. "Long story. We learned years ago not to let her ruin important occasions." The room chuckled again. Every word traveled through the crack in the doorway and settled somewhere deep inside my chest. I wasn't supposed to hear any of it. I had arrived 15 minutes early because my younger cousin Emily had begged me to help her calm her nerves before she walked down the aisle. Instead, I stood outside listening to my parents erase me with a smile. My fingers tightened around the gift bag I carried until the tissue paper crumpled. Family shame. It wasn't even the first time they'd called me that. It was simply the first time they'd said it proudly. I should have walked away. I almost did. Then another voice interrupted. Older. Calm. Sharp enough to silence the room. I don't think that's something parents should ever say. The ballroom became completely quiet. I leaned closer to the door. The voice belonged to the groom's father. His name was Richard Bennett. I had never met him before today. He continued, "And if that scar on her face is the reason you're embarrassed." My heart stopped. Then perhaps the people who should feel ashamed are standing in this room already. Silence. Complete silence. How did he know about my scar? How did a stranger know the one thing my own family refused to speak about? I pushed the door open. Every head turned toward me. The laughter disappeared instantly. My mother looked horrified. My father's smile vanished. Emily gasped. Richard Bennett looked directly at me. Not at my scar. At me. As though he'd been expecting me. And that was the moment everything changed. My name is Claire Matthews. I'm 31 years old. For almost 20 years, I've lived with a scar stretching from my left temple, across my cheekbone, ending just beside my jaw. People notice it before they notice my eyes. Children stare. Adults pretend not to. Strangers ask if it hurt. Friends eventually stop seeing it. My parents never stopped seeing it. To them, it wasn't just a scar. It was a reminder of something they'd spent 2 decades trying to bury. Growing up, they told everyone the same story. It was a terrible accident. Simple. Convenient. Finished. Whenever I asked questions, the answer never changed. You were too young to remember. When I turned 10, I asked again. You fell. At 15. You hit broken glass. At 20. Why can't you just let the past stay in the past? Eventually, I stopped asking. Not because I believed them. Because I realized they became frightened every single time I mentioned it. Fear was harder to ignore than lies. I almost didn't attend Emily's wedding. My invitation had arrived 6 weeks earlier. Cream-colored envelope. Elegant handwriting. Inside was a handwritten note. Please come. I know things are complicated, but you're still my favorite cousin. Love. Emily. Emily was the only member of my family who never treated me like a burden. She called every birthday, visited every Christmas, remembered details about my life. She never asked me to forgive my parents. She simply loved me anyway. So I came, not for them, for her. The ballroom looked beautiful. White roses, gold chandeliers, soft piano music floating through conversations. Everyone wore expensive clothes and practiced smiles. My parents stood near the front greeting guests. My younger brother Daniel stood beside them. Golden child, successful attorney, perfect husband, perfect son. He noticed me first. Oh, just one word. Oh, like I'd arrived unexpectedly, like my invitation had been a mistake. Mom immediately forced a smile. There you are. No hug, no kiss. No, it's good to see you. Dad adjusted his tie. You look different. I'd cut 6 inches off my hair. That was apparently worth mentioning. Not seeing me after 8 months. Daniel glanced at my face before quickly looking away. He always did. Not because the scar bothered him. Because talking about it made our parents uncomfortable. So everyone pretended it wasn't there. Except strangers. Strangers stared. Family ignored. Neither felt particularly kind. Emily spotted me from across the room. She practically ran over. There you are. She wrapped both arms around me. I was afraid you weren't coming. I almost didn't. She pulled back and smiled sadly. I know. Then she whispered, "Thank you." That tiny sentence made the trip worthwhile. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Emily looked genuinely happy. Her fiancé, Michael Bennett, couldn't stop smiling. For an hour, I forgot my family existed. I laughed, cried during the vows, clapped louder than anyone. It felt normal. Until the reception began. My assigned table wasn't with family. It wasn't with friends. It was beside the kitchen entrance. Table 17. 3 elderly strangers. 1 empty chair. Close enough to hear dishes clatter every few minutes. Far enough that no family photographs would accidentally include me. At first, I thought it had to be a mistake. Then I noticed Daniel sitting at the head family table. There was 1 empty seat. Mine. Someone had intentionally changed the seating arrangement. Emily hadn't done that. She loved details too much. Someone else had. I already knew who. Halfway through dinner, I walked toward the restroom. That's when I overheard my parents. The conversation that began everything. The one where I learned exactly who I was to them. Family shame. Standing in that silent ballroom after Richard Bennett defended me, I wanted to disappear. Instead, Richard slowly walked toward me. He looked around 65. Silver hair. Perfect posture. Kind eyes that somehow carried sadness. "I'm Richard," he said gently. "I know." He nodded. "I'm sorry you heard that." Before I could answer, my father stepped between us. "I'm sure this is all a misunderstanding." Richard's expression hardened. "No, it isn't." Dad forced an awkward laugh. "You don't know our family." Richard held his gaze. "I know enough." Mom quickly interrupted. "Claire, sweetheart, why don't we go somewhere private?" Sweetheart. Interesting. She hadn't called me that in years. I shook my head. No. People nearby pretended not to listen. Every single one listened anyway. Dad lowered his voice. "This isn't the place." "No," I replied. It wasn't the place to call me the family shame either. He opened his mouth, closed it again. For the first time in my life, my father had no answer. Richard looked at me. "May I ask you something?" I shrugged. "I suppose. Have your parents ever told you how you got that scar?" The room seemed to shrink. My heartbeat echoed in my ears. I answered honestly. "They say I fell through glass." Richard closed his eyes for a brief second. Almost like hearing those words physically hurt him. When he looked back at me, everything had changed. They lied. One word. Just one. But it shattered 20 years of certainty. Mom's wine glass slipped from her hand. It hit the marble floor. Red wine spread across the white tiles like blood. Dad grabbed Richard's arm. "Enough!" Richard calmly removed his hand. "No. You've hidden behind that lie long enough." Daniel finally stepped forward. "What exactly are you talking about?" Richard looked from my brother to my parents, then back to me. "I think," he said quietly, "Claire deserves the truth." My mother burst into tears. Not gentle tears, the kind that come from panic. "No," she whispered. "Please." My father wasn't crying. He was angry, furious. "You have no right," Richard answered without raising his voice. "I had every right the day I carried her out of that fire." Everything inside me stopped. Fire. No one had ever mentioned a fire. Not once. I stared at him. "I don't understand." "You will." He looked directly into my eyes. "But not here." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, pulled out a worn leather wallet. From inside it, he removed an old photograph. The edges were faded, the colors nearly gone. He handed it to me. My fingers trembled before I even looked. The picture showed a young man in a firefighter's uniform, standing beside a fire engine, holding a little girl. She couldn't have been older than 6. Half of her face was wrapped in fresh white bandages. Her tiny arms were wrapped tightly around his neck. She was crying. The firefighter wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking at her, protecting her, comforting her. On the back of the photograph, written in fading blue ink, were 7 words that turned my entire world upside down. To Richard, thank you for saving my daughter. Below those words was my mother's signature. I looked up slowly. She couldn't meet my eyes. Neither could my father. Because for the first time, they knew I finally had proof. Their story had never been true. And somewhere behind the lie, a far more terrifying truth had been waiting for me all along. For several seconds, Nobody moved. The music from the dance floor continued in the background, completely unaware that my entire life had just split into two versions. The one I thought I knew, and the one standing in front of me. I looked down at the photograph again. The little girl looked terrified, her face hidden against the firefighter's shoulder. The firefighter's left sleeve carried a department patch from a town I'd never lived in. At least, I thought I'd never lived there. I turned the picture over once more. My mother's handwriting was unmistakable. To Richard, thank you for saving my daughter. She couldn't deny writing it. She couldn't pretend it belonged to someone else. My voice barely came out. Who are you? Richard answered softly. I was the fire captain who pulled you out of your bedroom 24 years ago. I stared at him. My parents said. I know what they said. He paused. They've been saying it for a very long time. Dad stepped forward. This conversation is over. Richard didn't even look at him. No. Dad's jaw tightened. I said it's over. Richard finally faced him. No, Mark. The room went quiet again. You lost the right to decide that 24 years ago. People were openly watching now. No one pretended otherwise. Emily hurried over with Michael beside her. What happened? She asked. Nobody answered. She looked from my tear-stained face to the photograph in my hand. Then to my aunt, my mother. Aunt Susan. Mom looked like she was about to collapse. Emily, please, not today. Emily frowned. What do you mean, not today? Everyone's crying. Michael quietly rested a hand on his father's shoulder. Dad! Richard nodded. I know. He turned back to me. This isn't the place. I swallowed. Then where? My home. Dad exploded. You're not taking her anywhere. Richard laughed. It wasn't mocking. It was tired. You think she's still 6 years old? No. Dad snapped. I think you're trying to destroy my family. Richard's eyes became cold. No. You've spent 2 decades doing that yourself. I left the ballroom 20 minutes later. Not with my parents. With Richard. Behind us, I heard my mother calling my name. I didn't turn around. For the first time in years, she sounded afraid of losing me. For years, I'd been terrified of losing them. Funny how the roles changed once the truth started coming out. Richard lived 40 minutes away in a quiet neighborhood surrounded by old oak trees. His house wasn't fancy, just warm. Bookshelves, family photographs, a golden retriever that greeted us like we'd been friends forever. His wife had passed away years earlier. The house carried that quiet loneliness only people who have loved deeply seem to understand. He made tea. Neither of us drank it. I sat on the edge of the couch, staring at the photograph. Finally, I asked, "Tell me everything." Richard didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked to a cabinet, unlocked a drawer, removed a thick manila folder. It looked old, handled hundreds of times. He placed it on the coffee table. I hoped I'd never need this. Inside were newspaper clippings, fire department reports, insurance documents, medical records, photographs. So many photographs. Most I'd never seen before. One picture showed a house completely engulfed in flames. Another showed firefighters spraying water into shattered windows. A third showed paramedics surrounding a stretcher. I felt sick. Richard slid one article toward me. The headline read, "Local firefighter rescues 6-year OLD girl from second-floor bedroom." There was a photograph. Not very clear. Smoke. Fire. A firefighter carrying a child wrapped in a blanket. I looked closer. The child's face was covered, but one tiny hand stuck out from the blanket, holding a stuffed rabbit. My breathing stopped. I had that rabbit. Richard nodded. I know. I slept with it every night. I know. My hand started shaking. Then this is me. It is. I stared at him. My parents told me we moved because Dad got a better job. Richard sighed. No. You moved because everyone in town knew what happened. I couldn't breathe. What happened? Richard leaned back. When firefighters arrived. He stopped, choosing every word carefully. The front door was locked. So your parents were standing outside. I frowned. They couldn't get back in? They weren't trying to. I blinked. What? When our first engine arrived, he looked directly at me. Your father was holding your mother. They were screaming. But neither one told us there was still a child inside. Every hair on my arm stood up. No. Richard nodded once. We believed the house was empty. I felt like the room tilted. What changed? A neighbor. He answered immediately. Mrs. Alvarez. She came running across the street. He pointed toward one of the reports. She was screaming that little Claire was upstairs. I couldn't hear anything anymore except my heartbeat. Richard continued quietly. If she hadn't arrived. He didn't finish. He didn't need to. I'd already finished the sentence in my head. I would have died. No. The word escaped before I realized I'd spoken. No. They wouldn't. Richard didn't argue. They didn't tell us. Maybe they panicked. They did. They were terrified. But panic lasts seconds. His voice remained calm. It doesn't last through 3 separate head counts. What? We asked multiple times. Is anyone inside? Your father said no. I stood up. No. I don't believe that. Richard nodded slowly. I didn't either. Not at first. He opened another report. It contained handwritten witness statements. One belonged to Mrs. Alvarez, another to 2 firefighters, another to a police officer. Every statement matched. Every single one. My father had repeatedly insisted the house was empty. I stumbled into the kitchen. My stomach twisted violently. I gripped the countertop. Richard stayed where he was, giving me space. Finally I whispered, "Why?" "I don't know." I laughed bitterly. "No. You do." His silence answered me. I slowly turned. "What aren't you telling me?" He looked older than before. More tired. I promised myself. "What?" "That if I ever told you." He swallowed. "I'd tell you everything." He reached into the folder again. This time he removed a cassette tape. Old. Labeled with faded handwriting. Police interview, Susan Matthews. My mother. What is this? The original investigation. There was an investigation? Of course. I almost laughed. Of course there was. A child nearly died. Why wouldn't there be? What happened? Richard looked uncomfortable. It didn't go very far. Why? Your parents had influence. My father had been a city council member back then. I remembered hearing that. He always talked about community respect. Apparently respect could bury inconvenient questions. Richard placed an old cassette player on the table. I've kept this all these years. He inserted the tape. Press play. Static filled the room. Then a younger woman's voice. My mother's. She sounded different. Younger. Stronger. Officer. Mrs. Matthews. When did you realize your daughter wasn't outside? Long silence. Then. I thought Mark had her. Officer. Mr. Matthews stated he believed you had her. Another silence. Then quiet crying. Officer. Mrs. Matthews. I don't remember. Tape clicks. Fast forward. Another question. Officer. A witness says she heard your daughter screaming from the upstairs window while you were outside. Mom answered immediately. That's impossible. Officer. Why? Long pause. Then words that sent ice through my body. Because she wasn't supposed to be upstairs. The tape stopped. I stared at Richard. What does that mean? I don't know. But investigators asked the same question. I sank back into the chair. Everything hurt. Nothing fit anymore. Every childhood memory suddenly felt unreliable. Every family holiday. Every birthday. Every smile. Were they pretending? Or had they convinced themselves their own lie was true? Richard quietly stood. There's something else. Of course there was. There always was. He disappeared upstairs. When he returned, he carried a small cardboard box. Its edges were worn with age. He placed it in front of me. I found these after the fire. Inside, my entire childhood, a melted bracelet, a tiny pair of red shoes, my favorite bedtime story, half burned, a music box with smoke stains, and underneath everything, a small yellow diary, princess stickers on the cover. My handwriting. I gasped. I had a diary. Richard smiled sadly. Apparently. I thought it burned. So did everyone else. My fingers trembled as I opened it. Most pages were damaged. The first entries were exactly what you'd expect from a 6-year-old. Today Mommy made pancakes. Daddy bought ice cream. Emily came over. Nothing unusual. Then, about halfway through, the writing changed. Messier. Shakier. Like someone writing while crying. I read aloud. Mommy and Daddy keep yelling. Another page. Daddy said don't tell. My heart pounded. Next page. I heard Mommy say she's scared. Another. Daddy got mad because I saw. I looked up. What did I see? Richard shook his head. I don't know. I turned another page. Half of it had been burned away. Only one sentence remained. If I tell anyone, Daddy says we'll all lose everything. The next page was almost completely destroyed. Only 4 words survived. I'm hiding upstairs because... The rest had burned away. I stared at the missing section. Those missing words suddenly felt more valuable than anything I'd ever owned. Because somewhere after that sentence, everything changed. The fire, the scar, the lies, my parents calling me the family shame. It all started with whatever came after. I'm hiding upstairs because... I looked at Richard. I need to confront them. He nodded slowly. You will. But before you do... He reached into the bottom of the box. There is one last thing. He handed me a small silver key attached to a faded blue ribbon. I frowned. What does this open? Richard's face became strangely serious. I don't know. It was around your neck when I carried you out of the fire. My pulse quickened. You've kept it all these years? I was waiting. For what? For the day you were finally ready to learn why your parents spent 24 years making you believe you were the shame. He looked directly into my eyes. When the truth is that you were the only witness they were ever afraid of. I didn't sleep, not even for a minute. Richard insisted I take the guest room, but the moment I lay down, every sentence I'd heard replayed in my mind. She wasn't supposed to be upstairs. Daddy said don't tell. You were the only witness they were ever afraid of. I stared at the ceiling until sunrise, the silver key resting in my palm. It wasn't an ordinary key. It was small, old-fashioned, with a tiny number engraved on one side. 118. No company name. No logo. Just a number. At 6:30, I walked downstairs. Richard was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with 2 mugs of coffee and yesterday's newspaper folded neatly beside him. You didn't sleep either, I said. He smiled faintly. I haven't slept well since 2002. I sat across from him. I keep thinking about the diary. So do I. If I was hiding upstairs. I swallowed. What was I hiding from? Richard looked out the window before answering. I've asked myself that question for 24 years. By 8 o'clock, my phone had accumulated 37 missed calls. 24 from my mother. 9 from my father. 3 from Daniel. 1 from Emily. Emily had also left a voicemail. Claire, please call me. I don't know what's happening, but I know my wedding isn't important compared to this. I love you. Just, please let me know you're okay. I smiled despite everything. Emily. Always Emily. I called her first. She answered before the first ring finished. Claire. I'm okay. No, you're not. Her voice cracked. I've never seen Aunt Susan like that. I know. There was a long silence. Finally she whispered. Is it true? What part? The photograph. The firefighter. The fire. I closed my eyes. It looks that way. Emily took a slow breath. I found something. My heart skipped. What? After everyone left. I overheard your parents arguing. What did they say? I couldn't hear everything. She hesitated, but Uncle Mark said one sentence very clearly. I gripped the phone tighter. He said, she lowered her voice. If she remembers the basement, we're finished. The basement. I felt every muscle in my body tighten. What basement? I don't know. Our old house had one. I think so. I couldn't remember. Or maybe I had never been allowed to. Richard saw my expression the moment I hung up. What happened? I repeated every word Emily had told me. His face changed immediately. The basement. You know something. I know something I dismissed years ago. He stood so quickly his chair scraped across the floor. When investigators searched the house, they focused on the fire. Nobody paid much attention to the basement. Why? It wasn't damaged. I frowned. So most people don't inspect rooms untouched by fire. My pulse quickened. You think something was down there? I think. He looked frustrated. I think we all looked in the wrong direction. 3 hours later, we were standing in front of the house where I had nearly died. Except, it wasn't my childhood home anymore. The original house had been demolished. A newer one stood in its place. Fresh paint, Modern windows. Different front porch. I stared at the property from across the street. I don't remember any of this. Richard nodded. You were 6. An elderly woman watering flowers looked up. She froze, then slowly crossed the street. She couldn't stop staring at me. Claire. I blinked. Yes. Her eyes immediately filled with tears. Oh my goodness. She reached for my hands. I knew it was you. Richard smiled. Hello, Mrs. Alvarez. She looked at him. Richard. Then back at me. I've prayed I'd see you again before I died. I didn't know what to say. You remember me? She laughed softly. Honey, I could never forget you. We sat on her front porch, drinking lemonade. For nearly an hour. She filled in pieces of my childhood no one had ever shared. You were the happiest little thing. You followed butterflies. You loved drawing. You carried that stuffed rabbit everywhere. Then her smile faded. Until the last few months. What changed? She looked uncomfortable. You became quiet. You stopped playing outside. You cried a lot. I frowned. My parents said I was always shy. No. She shook her head firmly. You became frightened. Of what? She hesitated. I don't know. But every time your father's truck pulled into the driveway, you'd run inside. A chill spread through me. Then she said something neither Richard nor I expected. I almost called child services. The world seemed to stop again. You what? I thought someone was hurting you. Richard slowly turned toward her. You never told me that. She sighed. I should have. But I convinced myself I was imagining things. I barely breathed. What made you think that? Mrs. Alvarez looked directly at me. You always had bruises. I instinctively looked down at my arms, as if I might still find them there. My mother said I fell a lot. Mrs. Alvarez's expression hardened. No. You flinched whenever anyone raised their voice. Something inside me cracked. Not dramatically. Quietly. Like old glass, finally giving way. All my life, I defended my parents. Even yesterday. Even after Richard's story. I kept looking for explanations. For accidents. For misunderstandings. Now, those explanations were disappearing one by one. Before we left, Mrs. Alvarez disappeared into her house. When she returned, she carried a small cardboard envelope. I've kept this for years. She handed it to me. Inside were photographs. Neighborhood barbecue. Halloween. Birthday parties. One picture caught my attention immediately. I couldn't have been older than 5. I was smiling, standing beside my mother. But my eyes weren't looking at the camera. They were looking behind the photographer. Terrified, I turned the photo over. Mrs. Alvarez had written the date. Exactly 6 months before the fire. 6 months. Whatever happened, it started before the fire. The fire wasn't the beginning. It was the cover-up. On the drive back, neither of us spoke much. My phone buzzed again. Dad. I ignored it. Then a text. We need to talk. Come home. Alone. Seconds later, another message. Do not trust Richard Bennett. I showed Richard. He smiled sadly. They always say that. What? When someone tells the truth, the liar attacks the messenger. That evening, someone knocked on Richard's front door. 3 slow knocks. Richard looked through the window. His expression changed. It's Daniel. My brother. Alone. I opened the door. He looked exhausted. His tie was gone. His sleeves rolled up. Dark circles under his eyes. Can I come in? I stepped aside. For several minutes. No one spoke. Finally Daniel looked at me. I didn't know. I stared at him. About what? The fire. The investigation. The witness statements. I swear. His eyes were red. I found out yesterday. I searched his face. For the first time in years. I believed him. He reached into his jacket. I stole something. Richard raised an eyebrow. From who? Mom. He handed me a sealed envelope. No writing. No address. Just old yellow paper. I found her trying to burn it this morning. I slowly opened it. Inside, a legal document. 24 years old. The title read, Confidential Settlement Agreement. I frowned. What is this? Daniel leaned forward. Dad paid someone. Richard took the document. His eyes widened. Oh, what? Richard looked at me. This explains why the investigation disappeared. How? He turned several pages. Your father reached a private settlement with. He stopped. The insurance company. Why would that stop an investigation? It wouldn't. He flipped another page. Then froze. No. Daniel looked confused. What? Richard slowly looked at me. It wasn't the insurance company. Then who? He placed the document in front of me. I read the first line. Settlement between Mark Matthews, my father, and Thomas Green Construction. Construction? What does a construction company have to do with our house? Richard answered quietly. Everything. According to the documents, months before the fire, my father had hired a contractor to renovate the basement. The work was never officially completed. The permits were missing. Inspection reports were missing. Entire pages had disappeared, but one invoice remained. Item description. Removal of concealed storage room. I frowned. What is a concealed storage room? Daniel looked as confused as I was. Richard wasn't. His face had gone pale. In older homes, he said slowly, people sometimes built hidden rooms. My heart raced. What for? During wars. Or, he hesitated, to hide things. What things? He didn't answer immediately. Finally, documents. Cash. Stolen property. My stomach dropped. At the bottom of the invoice, someone had handwritten a note. Work suspended after child accessed restricted area. Every breath caught in my throat. Child. Me. I looked at Daniel. He looked back at me. Neither of us spoke. Richard finally whispered. I think. You didn't witness the fire. He looked straight into my eyes. I think you witnessed whatever was hidden underneath your house. Before anyone could say another word, a car screeched to a stop outside. Doors slammed. Voices. Richard walked to the window. His face hardened. Your parents. My mother was crying before she even reached the porch. My father wasn't. He looked furious. He pounded on the front door. Claire! Another bang. Open this door. Daniel stood. I'll handle Dad. No, I said. I walked toward the entrance myself. For 24 years. I'd been the frightened little girl hiding upstairs. Not anymore. I opened the door. Dad pointed a finger at Richard. He's poisoning your mind. I looked at him calmly. Then answer one question. He folded his arms. What? I held up the settlement agreement. What was hidden in the basement? For the first time in my entire life, I watched my father lose every trace of confidence. His face drained of color. His mouth opened. No words came out. Behind him, my mother started sobbing, so hard she could barely stand. And in that moment, I realized something far more frightening than any answer. They weren't afraid of me learning the truth. They were afraid, because someone else already knew it. For the first time in my life, my father looked frightened of me. Not angry, not disappointed, afraid. He stared at the settlement agreement in my hand as though it were something alive. Where did you get that? He asked. I didn't answer. Instead, I repeated the question. What was hidden in the basement? My mother let out a broken sob. Mark! He ignored her. Claire, come home. Answer me. We can explain. Then explain. His eyes darted toward Richard. This man has manipulated you. Richard folded his arms. I haven't said a word that wasn't supported by evidence. Dad's voice rose. You've been waiting 24 years for this. Richard didn't deny it. I've been waiting 24 years for her to be old enough to decide for herself. Silence settled over the porch. Finally, my mother whispered, Please, not out here. I looked around. Neighbors had begun watching from their windows. I shook my head. Fine. Richard stepped aside, and everyone moved into the living room. No one sat down. No one felt comfortable enough. It felt less like a family conversation and more like a courtroom where the verdict had already been reached. I placed the diary, the photograph, the settlement agreement, and the silver key on the coffee table. For objects, 24 years of lies. I looked at my parents. I'm done guessing. I want the truth. My father rubbed both hands across his face. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded 20 years older. The basement wasn't supposed to exist. What does that mean? The previous owner built a concealed room during the 1970s. What was inside? Documents. What kind of documents? He hesitated too long. Richard answered for him. Financial records. Dad shot him a furious look. Richard continued anyway. Records that proved Mark had been stealing money from the construction company where he worked. My heart stopped. I turned toward Dad. It's true. He closed his eyes. It started small. I didn't ask how it started. His shoulders slumped. Yes. The room remained painfully quiet. He spoke without looking at anyone. I thought I could replace the money before anyone noticed. But I couldn't. So I hid the records. In the concealed room. Daniel stared at him in disbelief. You stole from your own company? Dad nodded once. They were preparing an audit. I panicked. I looked at my mother. You knew. Fresh tears rolled down her face. I found out afterward. No. Richard spoke calmly. The police interview says otherwise. Mom buried her face in her hands. I knew. The words barely escaped her lips. I knew. I felt something inside me unravel. Not because my father had committed a crime. Because my mother had chosen to protect him instead of me. What did I see? I asked quietly. Dad finally looked at me. You followed me into the basement. The room blurred. I wasn't supposed to. I know. You found the hidden room. You asked too many questions. His voice cracked. You kept telling everyone about Daddy's secret room. I remembered something. Not clearly. Just flashes. A flashlight. Dust. Metal shelves. My father yelling. A heavy door. Then. Nothing. The fire wasn't an accident, was it? I asked. No one answered. I looked directly at my father. The fire wasn't an accident. His silence confirmed it. My mother whispered through tears. It got out of control. I stared at her. What got out of control? She couldn't answer. Dad finally did. I was burning the documents. Everything inside me went cold. The hidden room. Yes. You were burning evidence. Yes. You knew I was upstairs. He covered his face. I thought. His voice broke completely. I thought he'd already gone outside. Richard stepped forward. That's not what the witness statements say. Dad didn't argue. Instead, he whispered something so quietly I almost missed it. I heard you. I froze. What? I heard you calling for me. Every person in the room went still. You heard me? He nodded. I thought if I went back. He couldn't finish. You chose the documents. The sentence came out before I realized I'd spoken. No. His tears finally fell. I chose myself. No one moved. Not even my mother. She stared at him with the same horror I felt. You left me. He nodded. I did. The words landed harder than shouting ever could. I've hated myself every day since. I laughed through tears. Then why spend 24 years making me feel guilty? He looked broken. Because every time I looked at your scar, I remembered what I'd done. So you punished me instead. I convinced myself. He swallowed hard. That if everyone stopped talking about it, I'd stop hearing your voice from that window. My mother suddenly stood. No. She looked at him with disbelief. You don't get to put this on yourself alone. We all turned toward her. I helped. Her confession filled the room. I agreed to move. I agreed to lie. I agreed to tell Claire she'd fallen through glass. Why? I asked. She closed her eyes. Because if the truth came out, your father would go to prison, and Daniel would grow up without him. She opened her eyes. So, I sacrificed you instead. Daniel stumbled backward as though someone had punched him. You used me. Mom started crying harder. I thought I was protecting our family. Daniel shook his head. You destroyed it. For several minutes, nobody spoke. Then Richard quietly reached into his pocket. I think this belongs to Claire. He handed me another folded piece of paper. I recognized the handwriting immediately. Mine. Crooked. Childish. It had been tucked inside the back cover of my diary. I'd never noticed it before. It was a drawing. A little girl. A firefighter. A house. Underneath, in uneven letters, were the words. The fireman said brave means telling the truth. Richard smiled gently. The day after I rescued you, you told me you wanted to be brave. I promised you that one day, the truth would matter more than the scar. I couldn't stop crying. Not because I finally knew. Because for the first time, the scar made sense. It wasn't proof that I was broken. It was proof that I survived. A week later, I met with detectives. The statute of limitations had expired on some of my father's financial crimes. Others had not. Insurance fraud remained under investigation, after the old evidence resurfaced. Several former employees came forward once news spread. One investigation became 3, then 5. Secrets have a strange way of attracting other secrets. Daniel resigned from the law firm where our father had helped him find work. "I need to build my own name," he told me. For the first time in years, we had lunch together, not because we were pretending to be siblings, because we were trying to become them. Emily and Michael postponed their honeymoon, not because they had to, because they refused to let me face everything alone. Emily hugged me outside the courthouse one afternoon. "I kept thinking you were the strongest person I knew." I smiled. "I didn't feel strong." "You don't have to feel it." She squeezed my hand. "You just have to keep standing." 3 months later, my mother asked to meet me. Just us. No lawyers. No father. We met in a small park. She looked smaller somehow. Older. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said. "I don't even know if I deserve it." I listened. She reached into her purse and handed me a small velvet box. Inside was the silver chain that had once held the tiny key around my neck. "I found it after we moved." "You kept it?" She nodded. "I couldn't throw it away." Neither of us spoke for a while. Finally she whispered, "I should have chosen my daughter." I looked at her. Yes. There was nothing else to add. Some truths don't need decorating. I never fully reconciled with my father. We spoke only a handful of times after the investigation began. The last conversation happened nearly a year later. He looked at my scar for a long time before saying, "I spent 24 years believing it reminded me of my worst mistake." I waited. He lowered his eyes. "I finally realized, it reminds the world of yours." Then he walked away. It was the closest thing to accountability he ever gave me. It wasn't enough, but it was honest. Richard became family in a way no paperwork could ever explain. Every Sunday, we had dinner together. He taught me how to restore old photographs. We framed the picture of the firefighter carrying the little girl. It hangs in my living room now, not because I enjoy remembering the fire, because I never again want to forget what happened after it. Someone chose courage. Someone chose truth. Someone chose to save a child they had never met. People still notice the scar. Children still ask questions. Adults still glance twice. Now I smile. If they ask, I tell them the truth. I survived a fire when I was 6. Sometimes they apologize. Sometimes they say nothing. Either way, I don't hide anymore. Because the scars don't tell people who failed. They tell people who survived. For most of my life, I believed I was the family shame. That was the story my parents needed me to believe so they could live with themselves. But the truth was simpler. I was never the shame. I was the witness. And once I stopped being afraid of the truth, the people who had feared it all along were finally forced to face it themselves.